Kingdom Claus. Book 1. By Adam David Brown. Chapter 3. The Faded Houses of the Southeast. The great white plain stretched vastly between the two kingdoms. There was nothing but flatness and snow, always snow. Nothing moved out there, except for the winds or the occasional blizzard or snow squall. It would be the perfect road to head north or south, but its vastness and cold would take the life of any who traveled ill-equipped. To the east of this wide flatness was a small mountain range known as the Wandering Hills. And over those hills lay what became known as the Eastern Wastes. Long ago, this place was home to a great city called Winterdowns, a great trading post of the north, and a place of tremendous resources. For throughout the grand forest behind its borders was a place of plentiful hunting and trapping. This forest was the home of the giant elk, of which now are all but gone and only a few remain in the north. Well into the reign of Claus III, these bountiful lands started to fade, and its richness dwindled away slowly like water draining from a spout. It seemed as though a shadow had moved over the land, causing desolation and want. Many people of Winterdowns soon left its borders, seeking prosperity elsewhere, and the few that remained became hardened by the harshness of these lands. The once great city now lay a ruin, and has been for ages, almost as a crypt of the plenty that once dwelled there. The grand forest which was once evergreen, now stands of decay and cursed trees. Monsters of untold terror are said to live there, though it is unknown, for none have braved through the trees to find out. Some have said they've seen phantoms dancing around the borders of the fallen city, and many still who have sworn they've heard ghostly songs over the wandering hills. Legend tells of a demon, ancient and ageless, that lives in the caves beneath those cursed woods. This was a fell place, and there it sat to the east of the great white plains. To the west stood many mountains, high and rolling. This was a place of life, with many settlements of both Northmen and Vendigum. These settlements were not under the rule of either of the two kingdoms, instead they were townships, self-governed and self-contained within their mountain borders. For these were the free tribes of the north, only bound to the loyalty of their kinfolk and wished to not call anyone their king. Their mountains held mines of great jewels, though they were not open for wide mining. The mountain folk would instead often trade with the two kingdoms, for these people were not friends to either realm, but nor were they enemies. This place was known as the Free Mountains. At the end of the White Plains to the south lay the kingdom of Gordival, the realm of the four houses of the southeast. This kingdom's founding came in the same age as Claus I, and the two realms would share in taming the lands, helping each other to grow. As time rolled on, each kingdom became reliant within their own borders and no longer sought the assistance of one another. Travelers and traders venturing to and from the kingdoms would say that these places were two different worlds. The Northwestern Kingdom was always ruled by the line of Claus, with no others sharing power. The Kingdom of the Southeast would be divided amongst four houses, the line of Mandor and the houses of the three cousins. Keeping a promise to his three sisters, King Mandor I would establish four separate regions within the realm of Gordival, one for himself to rule and the other three for his nephews to control. So the kingdom would be of four governing states, or rather, townships. The king would still have absolute rule over the realm, but did not object to sharing power, as it lightened his burden under the crown. His three nephews would be cousins to each other and governing barons of trade to the folk of Gordival. And so this remained throughout the history of the north, with the sons of the three nephews continuing the line of barons. At the southernmost border of Gordival lay the birth of the river, Dannin, which opened up farther south into the unknown sea. The river itself would flow through the middle of the realm, being an important means of travel and trade. In the spring and summer it would flow freely, allowing for passage of boats and fishing. In the cold months, it would freeze over, becoming a passable road for sleigh and wagons. The river was wide and proud, and on the banks of the southern stretch lay the city of Berk, home of the house of Nigel. Nigel was the Baron of Berk, a township which relied heavily upon the fishing trade. Its borders lay on both banks of the Dannin, with a tall bridge spanning the two together. This place would be the last pocket of life in the south. If one were to travel down the Dannin and into the unknown sea, they would find nothing, for there was nothing else. There was no stronghold nor garrison at the city's southern border, for there was nowhere for an invasion to come from. At least this is what Baron Nigel felt. and this would be a point of contention between the houses of the three cousins for generations. Baron Nigel wished not for resources to be spent on a seemingly needless defense, where the other two barons felt it was irresponsible to leave the south so unprotected. Nigel felt that Berk's affairs were his alone and that his cousins should stay out of it, and he would begin to believe that his city was more important than the others, for he controlled the river and whatever travelled on it. Further north up the Dannon and on the western side would lay the city of Hadowsdale, home of the House of Erinson, Baron of these borders. In the southern realm lay only one mountain range, the Ore Hills, mountains with a tremendous wealth of iron ore within them. Hadowsdale lay right at the foot of these mountains, and this city relied upon the mines within for its wealth. Hadowsdale was the chief supplier of iron to all of the north, and Baron Erinson began to believe this made him more important than even the king himself. A little further north up the Dannon and on the eastern side lay the capital city of Merthenburg, home of the House of Mandor, king of Gordival. And this was the year that Mandor's line ended, as this was the passing of that once great house. This was King Mandor IX. He had only taken the throne a year prior to his death. His place on the southern throne was sudden, for King Mandor VIII died unexpectedly, leaving his only son to rule. There was no stewardship in this kingdom, for there wasn't a need, being that three other houses would have the power and birthright to the throne. Surprisingly, none of the barons wanted the crown, seeking only the wealth of their own cities. For in the recent years, the three cousins' minds had turned from the well-being of the kingdom to focus only on counting their own money. Greed and avarice was now upon their hearts, and the people thought it strange that the barons who were once decent are now ignoring their duty to the realm. And this was sudden, as though fell whispers had their ears. Since there was no blood heir or steward to take the crown, rule would pass down to the chief advisor of the king, which was Amaranth. At the northernmost point of Gordival, the river Dannon flows forth underground and begets the city of Califa, home of the House of Doldor, baron of this border town. Califa would serve as the chief marketplace of Gordival. Its position made it well suited to host merchants, travelers, and traders, for it was the only entrance to the southeastern realm. It was also known for its production of silk and exotic fabrics, which made a truly rare gem in the north. It was a bold city, brimming with markets and the exchanging of money. And for this reason, Baron Doldor had begun to think that he was the most important house in the realm, for without his city, the kingdom would have no platform on which to perform its trading. And therefore, all of the fish and silk and iron ore would be useless if it couldn't be turned into money. The recent years have seen the houses start to resent each other, with each feeling that they were superior to the others. And this lurking hatred began to cloud the southeastern kingdom, for a once proud realm now plays host to bickering squabbles between cousins. The neglect from the barons was beginning to shake the kingdom, and the people started calling Gordival the faded houses of the southeast. The people quickly lost faith in their leaders and now looked to Lord Amaranth to rule the realm and unite the houses once again. After being told that the young King Mandor had been killed by the deeds of the northwestern kingdom, most of the people rallied behind Amaranth, for he swore revenge on Kingdom Claus. But not all the folk in the southeast believed what they heard, and went about their business. It was early evening over Califa, the streets were oddly quiet and people slowly wandered about through the softly falling snow. There was something strange about this place in these recent days. It wasn't the city the traders from Hadowsdale knew, the people had become quiet with dead eyes. They had closed the markets and stopped allowing traders from within the realm to sell. And they soon began barring the traders from entering altogether. It would seem that Califa had succumbed to an unseen evil, a shadow had fallen upon this city. Down the eastern street and behind the great house, stood the troop house of Califa. It was a tall building, square and of dark stone. This is where the soldiers of the city were housed and the station of law and order. Beneath this place were the dungeons, a long hall with walls of stone, where only a few dim torches hung. There were several cells separated by iron bars from floor to ceiling. And there within a cell, upon a straw-covered floor, lay Brother Halding. His brown coat and robe torn and dirted, the side of his face bruised from where the soldiers struck him. He lay there on the dirty straw, still unconscious from the blow. He begins to stir and then suddenly awakens, as though from a nightmare. He shoots up, startled, and looks around frantically. He then remembers what had happened the evening before. "Ah, I see, we're finally awake. Those soldiers don't know their own strength, I suppose," said a voice from the dark corner of the cell. "Where?" "Where am I?" Halding asks, feeling the bruise on his face. "The most luxurious place in the city," the voice said, laughingly. "Who are you?" Halding asked. The man stopped his quiet laughing. "I'm Mortimer." "And you're in Califa, in the dungeon beneath the troop house," he answered. The voice moved closer into the faint light, and Halding could see the man from where it came from. He had long brown hair with pieces of straw stuck within it. He had no beard but a broad mustache and looked to be of middle age, and had seemed as though he'd been in this place for a while. The cell had nothing in it but straw, a pitcher of water, and a cup. Mortimer stood up and walked over to the pitcher. Pouring some water into the cup, he spoke. "I've never seen you around the city before, stranger. Trader from Haddowsdale, are you a Berksman, perhaps?" He handed Halding the cup and sat down in front of him. Halding drank the cup in one gulp, wiping the excess from his lips. He said, "Halding, my name's Halding. I'm a monk from the 1st garrison of the Northwestern Realm." "A monk from the garrison? Claus using monks instead of soldiers now," Mortimer laughed. "I'm an emissary of the kingdom," Halding replied, tiredly. Mortimer chuckled and said, "I'd say your skills at that could use some work, You're in jail now." Halding thought a moment as he further recalled the incident from the previous evening. He looked about the dungeon and said quietly, "We were attacked, the soldiers with me, killed. The Baron said that we killed the king. It was like a dream, nothing about it seemed right." Mortimer's face fell to a serious stare, as if his mind were wandering. He snapped out of it and said, "The Northwestern Kingdom isn't responsible for Mandor's death, it was that slithering slink of a man. I knew that Kester Fellow would be trouble the moment he became part of the council." The council he spoke of was the King's Council of Advisors, which was comprised of his bookkeepers and Amaranth. It was only recently that Kester was allowed to join, and this was at the behest of Amaranth. For through lies and deceit, Amaranth had gained King Mandor's trust. He was a devil with a silver tongue. And it was Mortimer who had noticed. "How do you know this?" Halding asked, looking confused. "I was on the King's Council. I was the bookkeeper of Califa, second in command to the good Baron, who, as you can clearly see, has treated me so well," Mortimer replied. Since trade and commerce were the primary governing powers of the houses in the southeastern realm, bookkeepers were very important and were lieutenants to the barons. Mortimer had been bookkeeper to Baron Doldor for many years, until now. "How then did you come to be in this place?" Halding asked, enthralled. "I knew too much," Mortimer said, and went on to explain that he overheard the plot to poison the king and of Amaranth's deceit. Doldor found out of his eavesdropping and, knowing that killing him would expose the plot, the Baron locked him in the dungeon instead. Mortimer continued to explain that Amaranth had also been the advisor to King Mandor VIII. And during that rule, Kester had been aiding Amaranth's ploys in secret. It was only recently that Kester made himself known. Kester was a dark magician who seemingly came from nowhere. He was a sworn servant to Amaranth who aided him with his magic. It's that Kester, you know? I knew there was something ill about him. He's helping Amaranth take the kingdom, and I'm afraid his plan is to take all of the north," Mortimer finished. "Is all this true?" Halding asked, perhaps already knowing the answer. Mortimer laughed and said, "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't." "This Kester, he isn't known to us," Halding murmured. "He wouldn't be. He was barely known to us. He came like an ill wind, and now our king is dead, the cities of this realm are in shadow, and Amaranth readies to invade your kingdom. All because of the spells of a snake, the forked tongue of a madman, and a king too decent to know better," Mortimer sighed, pouring himself some water. Halding looked concerned, raised his brow and said, "We hadn't heard anything from your kingdom in a long time." And in that silence, a plot unfolded. "Long ago, I heard Baron Nigel's bookkeeper say that Amaranth told the king to cut off ties to Claus, saying that it was more burdens to bear. I thought that strange, the whole thing was strange, even back then," Mortimer replied. Halding thought a moment and said, "I wonder why they didn't kill me." It was a fair question. The Baron commanded the emissary troops killed without a thought, why then would he not slaughter a mere monk? Halding felt a great sorrow for those men. They were his friends. He had been at the garrison for a while and he had earned their favor and they his. "Well, I suppose because you'll prove to be useful," Mortimer replied. He took a long drink from the cup and continued. "But trust me, they've already forgotten that you're down here. They've long since forgotten about me. It's that magic he puts on them." Halding looked up in utter confusion and asked, "Magic? Magic from whom?" "Kester," Mortimer replied, "something he does to them. Touches their heads and controls them. Have you seen their eyes?" Halding remembered the ill look that Doldor and his troops had about them. He knew then that something was strange, that there was a magic at work. He looked to Mortimer and said, "The eyes, they were yellow. Those troops seemed lifeless where they stood." Mortimer nodded his head and spoke. "Yes, yellow. As though the evil that was put within them was pouring out, like grain from a sack. Those men are not themselves anymore. Kester has them now. If this happened within Caliphate, where else has this magic taken root? How many houses have fallen in shadow? If all 3 barons were under this sway, then all of Gordival was lost to this darkness." Halding was full of questions and concern. He needed to send word to Borrow, to all the garrisons, to Claus himself. He needed to escape. "What of the other houses?" asked Halding. Mortimer dropped his head and replied, Lost in shadow. The cousins were the first to go. One by one, Kester had their ear in secret, singing a vile song, weaving their downfall. That snake had placed a seed of arrogance in each of their noble heads, listening to his lyric without ever knowing it. One by one, they turned their backs on one another. One by one, they closed their doors. With their gaze on their own cities, Amaranth had no obstacles in taking the kingdom, Halding said abruptly. Mortimer nodded and sighed, "Aye. This was set in motion a while ago, and none had seen it coming." It seemed for years prior, Kester had been singing his vile songs to each of the houses of the southeast, bewitching their hearts to spite and clouding their minds with his spell. The noble barons that once were, are now slaves to the will of Amaranth, for Kester made it so. And with that, the kingdom of Gordival fell like a house of cards. Now it shall forward its havoc north, across the great white plains and into Kingdom Claus itself. It had to be approaching early evening, but Halding did not know. There were no windows nor sign of light within the dark stone walls of the Gordivallian dungeon. It was a timeless place where, naught but a dank air was found therein. There was no other prisoners, only Mortimer and himself in the long, dark, stone dungeon. And even for a jail, this place felt strange. At the end of the stone hall was an iron door, to which a loud clank emerged. It slowly swung open and through it walked a Gordivallian soldier, tall and gaunt, his silver helmet hovering about his dead face. The yellow haze of his eyes seemed to gleam through the faint torch light. He approached Halding and Mortimer's cell with a slow and lifeless gait. He turned to the iron bars, and not even looking up, threw a round loaf of bread into the cell. He turned slowly back around and walked back to the iron door. "Ah, they remembered today," Mortimer chuckled, tearing off a quarter of the bread. He broke the quarter into 2 halves and handed one to Halding. Both men took a bite. The bread was stale and hard, but not moldy, sufficient for prisoners, Halding supposed. He thought as he chewed of how he would escape this place, and of what could have become of the first garrison. Immense worry overtook his thoughts, for any siege of the northwestern realm would surely start with the southernmost stronghold. Having only to deal with occasional bandits, that fortress and wall could only deflect a small force, but never a great host and certainly not an invasion. As there has never been such a need for grand fortifications. Perhaps the northwestern realm became far too assured with the quiet peace, far too confident with its 5 garrisons. Perhaps in its plenty, the kingdom's defenses are left ill-prepared. Claus was a great man, his only fault was said to be his trustiness. And enemies of the good king and of his kingdom would surely seek this as a weakness. Silence fell over the 2 prisoners and Mortimer stood up, walked to a corner of the cell and laid down on the dirty straw. "Well then, monk, perhaps I'll dream of a way for us to escape this place," Mortimer said, closing his eyes. Halding seemed as though he was struck with an idea. He scooted over to the stone wall of the cell and leaned his back against it. There, sitting cross-legged on the straw, he folded his hands, closed his eyes, and began to pray. Moment upon moment soon passed, and the young monk was in a deep trance, as though a heavy wandering sleep was upon him. His mind strayed far away. The night had passed over slowly, and the morning came, and farther away north, within an oaken chamber, an old man opens his eyes.